Albuquerque, New Mexico. The White residents at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane sat quiet in the desert morning, a modest 3-bedroom home where the real power resided not in the man of the house, but in his wife. Skyler White controlled everything. Every dollar, every decision, every detail of the household ran through her hands like water through a filtration system, and nothing escaped her notice. When Walter White dared to purchase printer paper with the wrong credit card, she caught it immediately. "Walt, the MasterCard's the one we don't use," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute domestic authority. He apologized like a scolded child. She was a trained bookkeeper, a woman who understood numbers the way her husband understood chemistry. She managed the family finances with precision that would make an accountant weep with envy. She wrote short stories in her spare time, sold items on eBay to supplement the household income, and carried their second child while raising a teenage son with cerebral palsy. The talking pillow at family interventions belonged to her. The meal planning, the budgeting, the social calendar with her sister Marie and brother-in-law Hank Schrader, all of it fell under Skyler's command. Walter White, by contrast, was a weak man. Everyone knew it. He taught bored teenagers about chemistry at a local high school. He worked a humiliating second job at the A1A Car Wash, where his boss Bogdan Wolinets treated him like dirt beneath expensive shoes. When his own students came through the car wash, Walt scrubbed their vehicles without meeting their eyes. When Bogdan needed someone to perform the most degrading tasks, he called on Walt. Skyler watched her husband's weakness with something between pity and frustration. She was the spine of this family, the one who kept everything from falling apart. Skyler White made a fundamental error in judgment. She looked at her husband and saw only what he had always been, a man who apologized when he should have fought back, a man who accepted humiliation at a car wash without protest, a man dying of lung cancer who would soon be gone from her life entirely. She believed she understood him completely. She believed she held all the power. When Walt began disappearing at strange hours, Skyler's response was not fear, but anger at the disrespect. During a family gathering at Hank and Marie's house, her sister let slip a detail that confirmed Skyler's suspicions. "What about that second cell phone?" Marie asked innocently. Walt denied it immediately, but Skyler knew the truth. Her husband was lying to her, and she would not tolerate such insubordination in her carefully managed household. She refused to let him touch her. When Walt leaned in for a kiss, she turned her face away with cold deliberation. "Congratulations," she told him, her voice dripping with contempt. "Shut up and say something that isn't complete nonsense." She became emotionally distant, making unexplained trips out of the house to assert her independence. If Walt could have secrets, then so could she. The balance of power needed adjustment, and Skyler intended to be the one adjusting it. When Walt finally offered to tell her everything, Skyler made what she thought was her strongest move. She refused to listen. "Whatever it is," she said, "I'm afraid to know." In her mind, this was control. If she didn't know the details, she couldn't be implicated. If she didn't engage with his secrets, he would eventually give up this rebellious phase. The cancer would finish what her cold shoulder had started. Marie and Hank saw the situation clearly, or so they thought. Poor Walt was dying, and Skyler was being unreasonably harsh. "He's going through so much," Marie said during one of their conversations. Even Skyler's own sister believed that Walt was the victim here, that Skyler's demands for honesty were somehow cruel given his terminal diagnosis. The entire family structure reinforced Skyler's view. She was the strong one, he was the weak one, dying of cancer. Skyler moved toward ending the marriage entirely. She consulted a divorce attorney, began sleeping in the guest bedroom, and told Walt to gather his belongings and leave the house. She gave him a deadline. She had already decided how this would unfold. The divorce would proceed, Walt would move out, and she would raise Walt Jr. and baby Holly as a respectable single mother whose husband had tragically passed away from cancer. She had options. She had control. The most revealing moment of her underestimation came when she confronted Walt about his relationship with Jesse Pinkman. She saw only a former student, a small-time dealer, someone beneath her husband's intelligence. She never considered that Walt might be the one corrupting Jesse rather than the reverse. She never imagined that her chemistry teacher husband could be dangerous. Skyler White believed that Walter White was weak because he had always been weak. She believed that a dying man with nothing to lose was still the same man who had apologized for buying printer paper with the wrong credit card. She believed she could simply walk away whenever she chose. She would learn, far too late, that the most dangerous opponent is the one you've already dismissed as defeated. Walter White was not the man Skyler thought she knew, and he began to prove this through careful observation rather than confrontation. He watched his wife closely, studying her the way a chemist studies a chemical reaction, identifying every variable, every pressure point, every weakness in her armor of control. He learned that Skyler would never call the police. Despite all her threats and anger, despite her fear and her disgust, she valued the family's reputation too much. She cared what Marie thought, what Hank thought, what the neighbors whispered over backyard fences. The idea of federal agents arriving at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane, of news cameras capturing her children's faces, of Walt Jr. learning that his father was a criminal, these possibilities terrified her more than Walt's secrets ever could. Walt also learned that Skyler's love for her children created a prison stronger than any divorce decree. She would do anything to protect them. This wasn't weakness. This was the foundation upon which Walt would build his trap. The turning point arrived when Hank Schrader was attacked. The DEA agent lay in a hospital bed, his body broken, his career uncertain, his medical bills climbing toward amounts that insurance would never cover. Marie was drowning in worry and debt. In this moment of family crisis, Walt made his first move. "I have money," he told Skyler. "Enough to pay for everything Hank needs." Skyler stared at her husband, seeing clearly for the first time that something fundamental had changed. The money was real, the offer was genuine, but accepting it would make her complicit in whatever criminal enterprise had generated such wealth. She understood this completely. She accepted anyway. She told Marie that Walt had won the money through gambling, through card counting at underground games. The lie came easily once she decided to tell it. She rationalized it as protecting Hank, as helping her sister, as doing what any good family member would do in a crisis. She didn't yet realize that this single decision had shifted the balance of power entirely. Walt pressed his advantage in small ways that Skyler barely noticed. He reminded her that spouses cannot be forced to testify against each other in court. "So there's that," he said casually, as if this legal protection was simply a fortunate side effect rather than a strategic consideration. He bought an expensive car for Walt Jr. despite Skyler's protests, demonstrating that her authority over household purchases no longer existed. Then came the speech that should have warned Skyler how completely she had miscalculated. When she suggested that Walt was in danger, that they should go to the police for protection, he looked at her with eyes she didn't recognize. "I am not in danger, Skyler," Walt said, his voice carrying a certainty that made her blood run cold. "I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No, I am the one who knocks." Skyler stood frozen as her husband walked away. She had spent years managing this man, controlling every aspect of his life, treating him like a child who needed supervision. Now she was beginning to understand that the balance of power had reversed completely, and she couldn't identify exactly when it had happened. The trap closed around Skyler White through her own expertise, her own intelligence, her own suggestion that she believed would solve the problem cleanly. Saul Goodman, Walt's lawyer, had proposed investing in a laser tag facility to launder the drug money. The suggestion was absurd, transparent, the kind of obvious front that would draw federal attention within months. Skyler dismissed it immediately. She was a bookkeeper. a woman who understood legitimate business structures and cash flow patterns. If they were going to do this, and she had already decided they were going to do this, they needed something believable. "The car wash," Skyler said. "We should buy the car wash where Walt used to work." The irony was perfect. The place where Bogdan had humiliated Walt, where her husband had scrubbed cars like a servant, would become their money laundering operation. It was a cash-intensive business that would raise no suspicions. People paid for car washes with $20 bills and rarely asked for receipts. The business model was simple enough that any accountant would believe the numbers Skyler planned to create. She researched the car wash's true value with the same precision she had once used to catch Walt buying printer paper with the wrong credit card. After factoring in expenses, revenues, and realistic profit margins, she calculated that the A1A Car Wash was worth exactly $879,000. She approached Bogdan with this figure, prepared to negotiate professionally. Bogdan laughed in her face. He demanded $10 million, then raised it to $20 million when Skyler pressed back. The price had nothing to do with business valuation. It was revenge for Walt's disrespectful exit, for years of perceived slights, for the simple pleasure of watching the White family squirm. Skyler didn't argue. She didn't plead. She disappeared for 3 days, then returned with Saul Goodman and a man named Patrick Kuby, who claimed to be from the Environmental Protection Agency. They conducted a surprise inspection that revealed shocking contamination levels in the car wash's water filtration system. The remediation costs would be enormous. The potential fines would bankrupt Bogdan completely. The closure orders would be immediate unless expensive upgrades were installed within 30 days. Bogdan's face went pale as Kuby explained the violations in technical detail. Skyler watched her former employer's defiance crumble into panic. When she returned the next day with her original offer of $879,000, Bogdan was ready to negotiate. $800,000, Skyler said, reducing her offer by $79,000. Final price. Bogdan signed the papers that afternoon. Skyler became the manager of A1A Car Wash, taking complete control of its operations and finances. She calculated that the business processed 19 cars per hour during a typical 10-hour workday. That meant 190 vehicles daily, each generating revenue that could be documented, tracked, and reported to the Internal Revenue Service with perfect legitimacy. Except the revenue wasn't legitimate. Skyler began creating false receipts for car washes that never happened. She inflated utility expenses on the books. She underreported actual income while overstating costs. She used a technique called structuring, breaking Walt's drug money into small deposits that stayed below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger currency transaction reports to federal authorities. Her bookkeeping skills, honed over years of managing household budgets and working for Beneke fabricators, made her exceptionally good at this work. She understood cash flow patterns, tax reporting requirements, and how to make fictional numbers look completely real. "I'm in it now," Skyler told Walt during one of their arguments. "I'm compromised." She said it like an accusation, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. She had compromised herself. The catastrophic defeat of Skyler White arrived not in a single moment, but through a series of escalating horrors that stripped away every shred of the control she had once wielded so confidently. She stood in a storage unit with her husband, staring at a mountain of cash so vast that her bookkeeper's mind couldn't process it. The bills were stacked floor to ceiling, packed into space that should have held furniture or Christmas decorations. Skyler had been laundering money for months, creating false receipts and structured deposits with mechanical efficiency, but she had never seen the full scope of Walt's operation until this moment. "How much is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Walt didn't know the exact figure. Neither did she. There was too much to count. Her careful systems, her precise accounting methods, her professional expertise, none of it mattered when confronted with currency measured in tons rather than transactions. She had become the manager of a money laundering operation so successful that it had outgrown her ability to manage it. "I want my kids back," Skyler said, but the words carried no authority anymore. The Ted Beneke situation demonstrated how far she had fallen from the moral high ground she once occupied. Her former employer owed the Internal Revenue Service over $600,000 in back taxes from the fraudulent accounting practices Skyler herself had helped execute years earlier. If the IRS investigation led back to her current activities at the car wash, everything would collapse. Walt's drug empire, her money laundering operation, the protection of her children, all of it depended on Ted paying his debt and closing the investigation. Skyler gave Ted the money, claiming it came from an inheritance. He used it to lease a new Mercedes instead. When she confronted him about this betrayal, he brushed her off with casual indifference. The old Skyler would have accepted this defeat. The new Skyler called Saul Goodman. Two men arrived at Ted's house. Huel Babineau and Patrick Kuby were not violent criminals, but they were intimidating enough to make Ted understand the consequences of refusing Skyler's demands. Ted tried to run. He slipped on a rug, crashed into furniture, and broke his neck in the fall. The sound echoed through his house like a gunshot. Ted Beneke would spend the rest of his life in a hospital bed, paralyzed from the neck down. Skyler had not intended this outcome, had not wanted anyone hurt, but her attempts to protect her family had destroyed an innocent man anyway. She broke down at the car wash in front of Marie, unable to maintain the facade of control any longer. She chain-smoked despite being around her infant daughter. During a tense dinner with Hank and Marie, Skyler walked fully clothed into the swimming pool and stood there in the water, her eyes empty, forcing everyone to acknowledge that something was catastrophically wrong with the White family. "Someone has to protect this family from the man who protects this family," Skyler told Walt when he tried to assert his authority over a decision involving Walt Jr. But she couldn't protect anyone. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't call the police. She couldn't stop laundering his money. She couldn't even keep him out of the bedroom they once shared. "I don't have any of your magic, Walt," she admitted in a moment of devastating honesty. "I can't go to the police. I can't stop laundering your money. I can't keep you out of this house. I can't even keep you out of my bed. All I can do is wait." She was waiting for cancer to kill him, waiting for this nightmare to end, waiting like a prisoner whose sentence had no defined term. The world discovered what Skyler White had become when everything collapsed at once, violently and without mercy. Hank Schrader drove into the New Mexico desert to arrest his brother-in-law, accompanied by his partner Steve Gomez. Neither man returned. When Skyler demanded to know what had happened, Walt delivered the news with chilling simplicity. "You're never going to see Hank again," he said. And in that moment, Skyler understood that her husband had allowed a DEA agent to be eliminated, her sister's husband, the man whose medical bills she had paid with drug money. Marie's world shattered. The sister who had once been Skyler's closest confidant now looked at her with pure hatred. The relationship between the two women, built over decades of shared history and family bonds, was destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Marie knew that Skyler had been complicit in Walt's operation, that her bookkeeping skills had enabled the drug empire that led to Hank's death. When Walt returned to the house after Hank's demise, Skyler met him with a kitchen knife. She backed away from her husband with the blade extended, her hands shaking, her face showing naked terror of the man she had once managed like a child. Walt Jr. threw himself between his parents, then called the police on his own father. The boy who had worshipped Walt, who had defended him against Skyler's cold treatment, finally saw the truth. Walt fled with baby Holly, triggering a massive manhunt. When he called Skyler hours later, he screamed accusations at her over the phone, calling her terrible names, threatening her if she cooperated with the police. Federal agents listened to every word, recording what sounded like a hostage situation, a battered wife trapped by a violent criminal. Skyler understood immediately what Walt was doing. The phone call was theatre, a performance designed to establish her as a victim rather than an accomplice. It was one final act of protection from a man who had destroyed her life. The protection was insufficient. Federal prosecutors descended on Skyler with evidence compiled from multiple sources. Jesse Pinkman had worked with the DEA before Hank's death, providing testimony about the operation's structure. Marie gave statements confirming Skyler's knowledge and involvement. The car wash's financial records told their own story of systematic fraud. Bank deposits matching the patterns of money laundering were traced back to accounts Skyler controlled. Then Todd Alquist arrived at her door with members of his crew. They walked through her home without invitation, their presence a silent threat that needed no explanation. They warned Skyler that talking to federal investigators would result in consequences for her children. She sat at her kitchen table after they left, chain-smoking, knowing that she had no protection from either side anymore. The house at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane was seized by federal authorities. Vandals broke in and spray-painted the walls with obscene messages. The furniture was stolen. The property became a local attraction for teenagers who wanted to see where the infamous Heisenberg had lived. Skyler moved into a cramped apartment with Walt Jr. and Holly. She worked as a dispatcher for a taxi company, using her maiden name Lambert to avoid recognition. She had lost the house, the car wash, the marriage, her sister, and her dignity. The competent bookkeeper, who had once controlled every dollar in the White household, now struggled to pay rent on a modest apartment. Walt Jr. refused to speak to her. He accepted money for college from Gretchen and Elliot Schwartz, the wealthy couple whose names Walt had always spoken with such bitterness. The boy blamed his mother as much as his father for the destruction of their family. Years after Walter White's death in a meth lab in New Hampshire, the full scope of Skyler White's transformation became a case study in how ordinary people become accomplices to extraordinary crimes. In the autumn of 2010, a phone call took place between Gene Takovich, the man formerly known as Saul Goodman, and his former assistant, Francesca Liddy. Among the updates about various legal proceedings and criminal investigations, Francesca mentioned a detail that closed one chapter of the Breaking Bad saga. "Skyler White got her deal," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had watched too many lives destroyed by association with Walter White. The plea agreement came after months of negotiation between Skyler's attorneys and federal prosecutors. She provided testimony against Saul Goodman and others in Walt's network. She gave detailed accounting of the money laundering operation at A1A Car Wash, explaining the techniques she had used to structure deposits and create false documentation. She handed over evidence that helped federal investigators understand the full scope of Heisenberg's empire. In exchange, Skyler avoided prison. The prosecutors recognized what Walt's theatrical phone call had established. She had been trapped by circumstances that began with trying to protect her family and ended with her becoming an essential component of a criminal organization. The line between victim and accomplice was never clear in Skyler White's story, and the federal justice system ultimately decided she belonged somewhere in the grey space between those categories. Marie Schrader reached out months after the plea deal was finalized. The reconciliation was tentative, painful, and incomplete. The two sisters had coffee in a neutral location, speaking carefully around the crater that Hank's death had left in both their lives. They would never be close again, but they were family, and that meant something even after everything had been destroyed. Walt Jr., who insisted on being called Flynn in the aftermath, refused all contact with his mother. He accepted the college fund that Gretchen and Elliot Schwartz provided, money that had originally come from Walt's drug operation but had been laundered through the wealthy couple's reputation. The boy saw his father as a tragic figure who had tried to provide for his family through terrible means. He saw his mother as the one who had failed to stop it, who had enabled it, who had profited from it while pretending to be its victim. Skyler White continued working as a taxi dispatcher, using her maiden name, living quietly in an apartment that bore no resemblance to the comfortable home on Negra Arroyo Lane. She had once been a woman who controlled every detail of her household, who caught every financial discrepancy, who managed her family with competent authority. She ended her story as someone who had used those exact skills to launder $80 million in drug money and enable 300 deaths. The lesson of Skyler White's destruction was taught in law enforcement seminars about money laundering and in psychology courses about complicity. How does a bookkeeper become a criminal? The same way a chemistry teacher becomes a drug manufacturer. One small compromise at a time, each decision rationalized as protecting something precious, each step making the next step easier until the path back has disappeared completely. Skyler White had thought she could control Walter White. She had underestimated a dying man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. By the time she recognized her error, she had already become exactly what she had tried to prevent. An accomplice, a co-conspirator, a criminal who had sacrificed her integrity in the name of protecting her family and had lost both in the process.